Hello and welcome, friends. On the behalf of Usanas Foundation, I welcome all of you to the third edition of Maharana Pratap Annual Geopolitics Dialogue. So it's 2024, and we are organizing the third edition of Maharana Pratap Annual Geopolitics Dialogue. We started it back in 2020 when the pandemic made its invasive presence in our lives and completely shattered everything. And we started understanding the meaning of the online existence. And in those days of crisis and in those days of turmoil, this little organization came up. And I'm very proud to mention that over the last 3 years. We have definitely achieved something. We have been able to make a mark in the sphere of international relations and diplomacy through our own efforts, and definitely through a very distinct and very unique message that we are trying to convey through our activities and also through our various publications. Last year, we had the Maharana Pratap Annual Geopolitics Dialogue in Udaipur. It was graced by former President of Croatia, Mrs. Kolinda Grabar, and many other dignitaries, including a couple of ambassadors. And it's really difficult, I can tell you that. I mean, for people to travel from Delhi and various parts to this small remote city of India, it's definitely a challenging task. But I'm really thankful that people are taking time out and they visited the city and attended this event and made it a big success. The whole idea behind organizing Maharana Pratap Dialogue in Udaipur is that we want to take the discourse on international relations and foreign policy beyond the national capital cities of India. So far, it's considered something like a turf which is owned by the so-called elitist institutions of Delhi and the power circuit of Delhi, including the diplomats and all. But I feel that in the age in which we are living, this is the age of transition, and foreign policy is no more foreign. I guess people today, even in the remote parts of the world, remote parts of the country, they feel very strongly about the issues that are international and issues that pertain to a country's sovereignty, territory, and its values and morals. Particularly after the advent of the communication technology, social media, things have found it very difficult to remain confined to the national capital territories. With the advent of social media and with their rapid spread, it's very difficult to check and difficult to prevent the spread of ideas. So, with this idea in mind, we definitely take this discourse on international relations and foreign policy to the smaller cities of India, and we try to get the youth, the new people, the new kind of thought leaders involved in this whole process and contribute something very meaningful. Without wasting much time, I will formally begin the conference today. And today we have a very special person with us, Burzine Waghmar. He has spoken at Usanas Foundation's events earlier also, and we wanted to invite him to the offline part of the conference this year, but somehow it couldn't materialize. So definitely we look forward to seeing him in person sometime next year. But we shall begin with his interview. I'll read out his brief bio. Mr. Burzine Waghmar, he's an affiliate with Center for Iranian Studies and SOAS South Asia Institute, and he's a former inaugural Visiting India Fellow, RUSI, and Senior Fellow at Usanas Foundation. To me, he is a great expert on issues related to Afghanistan, Iran, Baluch movement, and the kind of insights which he has shared with me and with at various events of Usanas Foundations. I found them immensely remarkable and very insightful, and definitely he brings a very unique historical perspective. So today we are here to discuss a very important subject with him, and the topic of our today's interview is the octopus and its rings, understanding Iran and its proxy actors. The conflict in West Asia is going on, and we all, in a way, believe that it may escalate in the future. We have seen the recent activities of Houthis, recent activities of the pirates in the Red Sea, the capture of the ships, and the NATO strikes also in the Red Sea. So we are all interested in Iran. So today we are going to discuss various aspects of Iran, including its drone prowess, including the Islamic regime in Iran, what is the future likely scenario, and also some strange things like Iran's support to Armenia against countries like Turkey and a Shia country like Azerbaijan. Iran's unique relationship with India, where we believe that we have civilizational connectivity and ties with this country, but at the same time, India's strengthening ties with Israel something which not going down very well with Iran. So these are the various issues which we are going to discuss with our expert, Mr. Burzine Waghmar. Burzine, over to you. You begin with your introductory remarks. Take as much time as you want, and then I'll come back to you with some specific questions.
Thank you, Dr. Pandya. Thank you, Preeti, and the Usanas Foundation and its Board of Trustees. My gratitude also to the Ministry of External Affairs India, as well as other sponsors for yet again coming up with this munificent outlook towards subventing this seminar. And I do hope it continues and grows from strength to strength. So my gratitude to all of you here sitting in England. My introductory remarks are as follows. The Middle East or Southwest Asia in Indian officialese is always in the news for the wrong reasons. It is as much a truism as the one repeated by my late teacher and expert on US-Iranian relations, Professor James Bill, who would remind us, as undergraduates nearly 30 years ago, that things in the Middle East go from bad to worse, and the cycle repeats itself. 7th October 2023 saw, for the first time since the Holocaust of the last century, the largest, unprovoked, unannounced, wholesale, premeditated slaughter, rape, and mutilation of Jews, men, women, and children in a 24-hour period. Not for being Israelis, but for the audacity to live and to be Jews. Note. Atrocities too hard to digest, but true, cannot be dismissed, including the beheading and selling of heads of Jewish children online, only to be discovered by distraught parents. In the months following that Hamas massacre, nearly 10 countries have been caught up in the fighting which has spread across the Middle East. Hezbollah and Israel are already engaged in a low-grade war as Lebanon becomes dysfunctional by the day. In fact, ladies and gentlemen, there are times when I'm led to think Pakistan is far more stable and has a greater chance of continuing rather than withering away as a state like Lebanon, which has gone to rack and ruin thanks to Palestinians squatting there for over a quarter of a century. But as an Iranist, let me not digress and come back to Iran. It must be patently clear to all by now that President Trump was correct in reneging on the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, JCPO agreement signed by his predecessor in July 2015. The contention among misguided leftist liberals that bringing the Islamic Republic into the Comity of Nations and integrating its markets might modify its conduct at home or abroad was fatuous thinking. It still lingers as an article of faith among naive Westerners, basically apologists for a regime whose diktats they would not choose to follow if they were its citizens. Iran seeks no rapprochement with the West, for its very raison d'etre is driven by unrelenting radical hostility and, in the final analysis, futile attempts at amplifying its sense of exaggerated, Shia-inspired third world victimhood. The Islamic Republic, 45 years on since its inception, is a regional and global pariah determined to carve spheres of influence in Yemen and Lebanon by arming and monetizing proxies instead of rectifying its dysfunctional economy, finance Hamas and host Holocaust deniers at officially subvented conferences or cartoon competitions, attain strategic depth by turning Iraq into an unthreatening vassal, like Pakistan pursues with Afghanistan, support the Syrian regime in the face of Islamic ostracism across the Arab League, OIC, and GCC, and foment riots during the most important Muslim event annually, the Hajj. So when Iranians are not abetting coups in Bahrain, 1981, or rampaging across Mecca and the Haram Sharif, 1987, their government is busy enabling Houthis to fire UAVs over Riyadh International Airport and the Saudi Defense Ministry, 2020. All in the West now acknowledge it was Tehran who attacked Saudi Aramco's Khurais oil field and Abqaiq refining plant, thus halting nearly half of daily Saudi production output and 5% of global supplies in September 2019. Almost 80,000 Iranian militia are embedded in Assad's Syria with supplies of missiles, armaments, and building military facilities. Tehran has been accused by Morocco of fomenting trouble, already brewing for decades by training the Polisario Front fighters in the disputed Western, formerly Spanish Sahara. Sectarian relations in Iraq have deteriorated since the fall of Saddam Hussein, so it's downright absurd to declare Tehran played an instrumental role in defeating ISIS which would never have come about if the blatantly biased Shia regime that took power after 2003 had not alienated Sunnis to such an extent to conceive such a murderous outfit whose bestiality even put Saddam Hussein and Hafiz Assad, egregious Baathists running police states, in the shade. And are we to simply believe all this is because Iran, as a regional heavyweight like India, feels it has a natural, historic right to be recognized in the Indian Ocean region? If so, ladies and gentlemen, how does one explain Iran in meddling in the badlands of the Sahel, Western Sahara, and Central Africa? Why is the IRGC setting up terrorist cells, recruiting mercenaries and insurgents, dispatching them for firearms training to Syria or Lebanon, and reposting them to Chad, Central African Republic, and the Sudan? What are these networks for if not to be kept on standby for future attacks at Western diplomatic missions or interests in sub-Saharan Africa? Until 2007, there were no diplomatic relations between Iran and Bolivia. By 2024, we have a bilateral defense agreement, much to the alarm of all its other Latin American neighbors, particularly Argentina. President Morales' hard-left government broke off relations with Israel, which is hardly surprising, given how Tehran has lavished on him spare parts for his air force, drones, and visits by Iranian military and intelligence officials. But that is just one half of the story. Nicolas Maduro's dysfunctional Venezuela, the worst economically in the continent, January 2024 inflation rate 107%, with rampant robberies reported in graveyards for belongings, but also coffins, which are scarce in Venezuela, and buying one costs almost a year's minimum wages, is the only country in all of Latin America whose armed forces are equipped with drones, and not to mention precision-guided short-range missiles. Venezuelan military presence, following a treaty with Bolivia, saw not just its troops, but also the advent of Iranian military personnel at the port of Puerto Quijaro, bordering Brazil. And this inland waterway does eventually drain into the Atlantic. To quote Joseph Humaya, August 2023 in the Middle East Forum, quote, "Delivered under the guise of commercial cargo shipments from Iranian auto manufacturers, the episode reflects Iran's mastery of dual-use transfers and its ability to blend commercial and military projects. This capacity has helped Tehran penetrate deep into Latin America, evading US and international sanctions, but also confusing Latin American intelligence agencies who are unfamiliar with Iran's covert military programs," close quote. Iran, at the time of writing, has arrested more than 15,000 and shot dead over 550 of its citizens since the anti-hijab protests erupted in September 2022. The death of a young Kurdish girl brought all Iranians out in defiant revolt, even as the regime mendaciously deflects blame on Zionists or its own beleaguered Sunni minorities, Baluchis and Kurds. Security forces have shot dead unarmed mosque worshippers in Zahedan, Iran and Balochistan, and fired rockets at Kurds into northern Iraq, plus those within its borders domiciled in Iranian Kurdistan. An Amnesty report of December 2022 pointed out how children represent 14% of overall deaths of all protesters and bystanders, which has exceeded 300 since the protests erupted. Iranian authorities routinely harassed and intimidated the families of child victims to coerce them into silence or to force them to accept narratives absolving authorities for their deaths. Only then are their bodies released. And over 60% of the children killed are from Iran's Baluchi and Kurdish, repeat, Sunni minorities. These communities have long suffered from systemic discrimination and persecution by the authorities. And Baluchis and Kurds, Sunnis, and as Iranian Sunnis know only too well how Tehran, the capital of a self-styled Islamic Republic since 1979, West Asia's largest metropolis of over 9 million, has no Sunni mosque. Muslim diplomats, in the main, in that city, pray at the Pakistan embassy. But that isn't exactly an option exactly open to all Sunni Tehranis at large. Iran has no compunction in killing its own, never mind abetting the murder of civilians across not just the Middle East, where it harbors endemic rivalries and sectarian issues with fellow Muslims, but also Ukrainians by supplying Shahed 136 drones and artillery shells to Putin's murderous regime. Hence, Iran is directly engaged in obliterating Ukrainians and their civilian infrastructure. Drones are now assembled outside Kazan in Russia, and intelligence reports now confirm domestic production in Russia of Shahed 136 drones, which were earlier being imported. Iranian trainers and technical support are present on ground in occupied Crimea, and the Revolutionary Guard Corps, after all, admitted the pre-dawn shooting down of a Ukrainian civil airliner, a Boeing 737, taking off from Tehran, killing all 176 on board in January 2020, 2 months before the world went into lockdown, if you care to recollect. Tehran has also assisted Putin in running ghost armada fleets to sail with Russian oil. More than 79 vessels with previous experience shifting surreptitious Iranian and Venezuelan oil are now transporting Russian crude across the globe. India prefers to quietly deal with Iran lest it irks an important neighbor, keeping the Pakistan card in mind. But New Delhi has privately found Tehran exasperating to deal with. Attacks on Israeli diplomats in its capital in 2012 and 2021, Indo-Iran UCO Bank Calcutta branch trade, or rather Hawala scheme of 2015 to the tune of rupees 20,000 crores or US $296 million, and cancelling and signing international treaties as it pleases. This last should be an eye-opener to the Indians. ONGC Videsh undertook the discovery of a 3,500 square kilometer offshore block containing 23 trillion cubic feet of gas reserves in the Persian Gulf. India, since 2008, has spent $85 million on this deal, discovery, progress, and the like. Discussions from 2015 to date have gone back and forth, with Tehran offering, rejecting, and re-offering India a 30% stake in this gas basin. True, sanctions in the pre-2015 period did stall talks, but in 2020, Iran decided to offer the development of the basin to an Iranian firm. So there is no appetite to exonerate or accommodate Iran within the global community. It is not dictated by Western but universal pressure for no liberal, genuinely representative government anywhere, and not just the Western Hemisphere, can condone such an repressive, irresponsible regime determined to go nuclear and positively fixated on how Israel, quote, must vanish from the arena of time. Ahmadinejad's statement, which I quote from the original Persian, as Sahaneh Ruzgar Mahv Shavid. One has to be exceedingly obtuse not to realize the import of this, literally and metaphorically. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Burzine, for outlining the various aspects of Iran's and its activities in different parts of the world, and also making us aware about its covert military programs and covert intelligence programs. But then now I have some very specific questions to you. As the title of our today's interview suggests, I would like you to focus a bit more on Iran and its proxies, in that entire region. So, I mean, while I was working in Kashmir, we always used to discuss that Iran copied this playbook from Pakistan. The way Pakistan created a very successful proxy-based insurgency in Kashmir, and also in Afghanistan. Later, the IRGC and the Iranian regime copied this model, and now I guess they have already surpassed their master or surpassed their inspiration, and they have this excellent system of proxies in that entire region. So would you tell us a bit more about this relationship, how it works, what can they do, and what is the nature of this relationship? Yeah.
First things first, Dr. Pandya, I'll rhetorically answer that by putting this way a question to you. So indulge me. Why was the GCC formed in 1981? There was nothing pre-81. You don't suppose it had anything to do with the Islamic Revolution of 1979? And all the Persian Gulf sheikdoms became so jittery, so insecure with what was happening on their doorstep when they saw a regional heavyweight like the Shah, who had nuclear ambitions, who had his prowess and outreach in the Indian Ocean, completely toppled, and the entire Iranian regime, the monarchy, collapsed like a house of cards. So that, in a way, I believe answers, but let me now go on into detail. All these proxies goes back to the Iranian Revolution and Khomeini's idea of exporting it throughout the Islamic world, regardless of Shias or Sunnis. Khomeini could play on the fact that he was a radical, a supposedly progressive, pious leader who wanted to oust all these capitalist lackeys of the West and just stooge regimes which are unrepresentative. He could play on that with both Shia and Sunni sentiments, but obviously more so Shia, which explains why the GCC was formed in 81. And Bahrain's attempted coup, which was in advanced stages in December 81, was aborted because it was discovered. They again tried in 87, but it failed. In 87, the Hajj Mecca riots took place, as I pointed out. And there has been this consistent attempt to the near assassination attempt on Sheikh Jabir al Sabah in Kuwait in 1986. And then, of course, the war started with Iraq between 80 and 88. And therefore, the Gulf kingdoms realized it's time to back Saddam. Not that they had any skin in this fight, but to back Saddam in order to get rid of this radical regime, which would set a bad precedent in the region. And at the same time, when I said exporting this revolution is exporting the Khomeini Iranian Islamic Republic's worldview, it is important to note at this point, Pakistan went into a chaotic spiral, and sectarian riots in Karachi between Shias and Sunnis and Mujahid free for all that we saw from the 80s was thanks to Iran. One often hears this Kalashnikov culture spoken about among Pakistani liberals who lament how their country has gone to seed. Well, I wish they would pause for a moment and realize it had nothing to do with the Red Army, and this so-called Kalashnikov culture is a misnomer. The problems in Pakistan started before December 79, before a single Red Army soldier crossed into Afghanistan as they did on Christmas Eve, 24th December. It started from April 79 when Zulfikar Bhutto was executed by General Zia, and also because of Khomeini, the rioting and activism among Pakistani Shias that had taken place. And Zia was already in a beleaguered position. As it is, he had come to power in July 77 as a discredited military leader. He wanted to control the place. And so, and this is very important to note, please, Zia gave Sunni militants a free hand to even out the playing field and take care of Pakistan's restive Shia. It is that which led to this spiral of violence and Karachi becoming a combat zone like Beirut, and particularly during the 80s and 90s, which even Benazir Bhutto had to deal with, and the Sindh Rangers and all the rest of it that we keep hearing about. It had nothing to do with Kalashnikov culture. It had nothing to do with blaming the Americans, as Pakistanis or most people tend to think so. It was Iran which fomented it. And it was Khomeini's lie, Dr. Pandya, on 4th November 1979, which was the first day of the new Islamic century, 1400, and the first day of the month, first Islamic century onset, when he said that the Grand Mosque in Mecca has been seized by Americans and Zionists, when it was actually Saudi ultra-fundamentalist Sunnis who had seized the precinct. And because of Khomeini's sheer lie that went around the Muslim world, the American embassy in Islamabad was burnt to the ground. And of course, Zia did nothing about it, and Pakistani came a bit too late to just about save some American diplomats who were practically standing in the clothes they were when the building was raised. So Iran has a lot to answer for in Pakistan and also around the region as such because of this exporting of its radical worldview, which goes to the inception of the 1979 revolution, which is why they're all so jittery about it. Because it's not just the revolution, it's the, Khomeini used to call Saudi Arabia, sarcastically, American Arabia. Like it's a stooge. It's not a country. It's an artificial entity. It needs to be demolished. This, that, and the other.
Thank you, Burzine. So my next question is about the Iranian relationship with Saudis and the Turks. Like we have all heard about this very intense Saudi-Iran rivalry for lording over the Ummah and the Muslim world. At the same time, we also hear about this Iran-Turkey relationship in a very mixed manner. Like you see in the case of Armenia, Azerbaijan, Iran and Turkey, they are both on the opposite sides. But at the same time, we also hear about this Erdogan's, of on and off love-hate relationship or some mild, occasional bouts of cooperation with Iran. Can you tell us a bit more about this relationship? And also, while discussing this, if you can enlighten us a bit more about this China's intervention to bring rapprochement between Iran and Saudis.
Yeah. Uh, Excellent question. Uh, all of these three players vie for Muslim loyalties and prestige across the Islamic Ummah. No denying that. Riyadh, of course, by the fact of being the site of the holy places, so it obviously gets first dibs in any question. With Iran and Turkey, you must realize that both of them, unlike other countries in the Middle East, are civilizational societies, ancient societies compared to the GCC states or Saudi Arabia, which were just entities created in the 20th century after the British left. Saudi Arabia in 1933, UAE, Bahrain, Oman, and Qatar only after 1971. So both of them have a long sense of history and of ruling. Of course, the Ottomans defeated the Safavids, who were the Persian Shias, and the rivalry goes back to the medieval period as such. Iran became a Shia state in 1501 under the Safavid dynasty. Until then, Iran was a Sunni state. That's also something people don't realize. Iran was very much Sunni up to 1501, from the time Islam came to Iran in 651 AD. Turkey was always Sunni, be it Ottomans or Seljuks. But of course, both of them in the region of the Caucasus that we talk about were always fighting for control. And most of the times, the Ottomans did have the upper hand over the Safavids, the Persians. And of course, Iran has never really forgotten that. It has been wary of it. This new relationship, of course, in the sense that Erdogan has neo-Ottomanist aspirations of leading the Muslim world as a progressive Muslim leader, not cut from the Iranian too radical or the Arab too conservative monarchy fold, but a Western suited leader who can show a new Islam, as it were, has always been part of his playbook, as we do know. But be that as it may, this sudden alliance of convenience between Ankara, Tehran, and Doha, also that we see, is fleeting because each of them mistrusts the other. And of course, Doha, of course, has received flack from a lot of its own GCC members by getting too close to Tehran. The oddity of the Armenian element is this in Iranian society, that Iranian Christians are Armenians, historically speaking. Iran's Christian community are Armenians in the main. And they have always been well integrated as such. Armenians are, like Zoroastrians, of course, not considered a troublesome minority. They keep their head down. It's the Jews, Iranian Jews, who receive the flack, and worst of all is the Baha'i situation, as you know only too well, who are treated just as the Ahmadis are treated in Pakistan. It's open season to kill and decimate them without any questions asked or any repercussions. The oddity is that, yes, why does Iran support what is a Christian society and a Christian civilizational society, because Armenia is the oldest Christian country in the world, is because it has always had good relations with them. I remember in the mid-90s when an Iranian diplomat once said, of course we get on with the Armenians. This is the Iranian diplomat saying, we are surrounded by nutcases. It's the only sane neighbor we have. It was revealing when he said that. And I remember this from my student days in the US. Therefore, Armenia and Iran have had this alliance of convenience. Plus, because I mentioned of the historic impress in Iranian society of Armenian Christians, so that does play out, which is why Iran finds itself at odds with a fellow Ummah member like the Azeris of Azerbaijan. And please remember that just as there is what was Soviet Azerbaijan, which became the Republic of Azerbaijan now, Dr. Pandya, there is an Iranian province called Azerbaijan too, just as West Bengal is in India and East Bengal became Bangladesh. So there is that element where Iranian Azeris are also part of Iranian society, and but they're not Persian strictly speaking. Like Kurds, they are a different ethnic group, Azeri speakers, but they're Shia. So that is something which the regime in Tehran has also had to delicately balance. Just as Balochistan exists in Pakistan and Iran, there is an Azerbaijan within Iran, but also just across the border too. And Khamenei, incidentally, is an Azeri. He's not a Persian, strictly speaking, by ethno-linguistic origins.
Thank you.
So that explains why it always, oddly enough, favored Armenia, when you would think their modus operandi would be to always inevitably look at an Islamic cause and just blindly ally with any Muslim country, regardless of the merits or demerits of a case. So with Kashmir, of course, in Iran, even Pahlavi Iran, Royal Iran, Imperial Iran, pre 79, on principle, on the books, would support Pakistan as it did during the 65 and 71 wars.
I'll come
Um,
back to that question
so,
in my
yeah.
India-Iran relationship. But before that, no, I'll just have one more question. So, could you tell us a bit more about the current status of this Iran's nuclear program, and also how the fight, this whole conflict in West Asia, can unfold in the future? Is it going to escalate? And do you vision Iran getting involved into this whole conflict directly or in a more aggressive form in some manner in the future? Or Iran is going to exercise this classic restraint, which it has done so far, and operate only through proxies? So please tell us more about this.
The current signs show that it would continue operating like the proxies. In fact, it reminds me of again what Zia used to say about Kabul. Keep the temperature boiling in Kabul, but just see that the kettle doesn't boil, it only simmers. That is their attitude towards the Middle East, with the Yemen Houthi issue, with Hezbollah keeping keeping Israel, on guard and in a state of siege, with Hezbollah, and with Iraq, and in the case of Iraq, of course, attacking Western interests, Western diplomats and troops as such. Uh, Likewise with Syria, too, so to speak. So they will obviously want to deny responsibility, but they will continue funding them. And I'm not saying that China is a restraining hand, because, and that's an important point. One talk, and that brings me to the China factor, because you did ask earlier. Um, let's dispel the notion that China is going to enter the political vacuum in the Middle East and help everyone, because it doesn't have baggage like the Americans or the British, as white colonial hangovers and the rest of it. The Chinese are just as neo-colonial in their outlook and just as transactional. And when people talk about the Chinese restraining Iran recently on Houthi attacks, Dr. Pandya, that was only for Chinese freighter ships. They did not give a toss about other ships that were passing through the Bab el Mandab, right across the Yemen coastline, going up to the Red Sea and coming into the Mediterranean. Beijing put pressure on Tehran to put pressure on the Houthis, only to see that their ships were not damaged. So China is not interested in playing any game at all, so long as it saves its own skin. And it has this transactional attitude towards the Middle East. It has no interest in being sucked into any issues with either this or that side. It is too wary of so doing. It only looks at it economically and politically when it can score some points, when it can take an anti-Western attitude by playing at the fact that we are not colonials, we are fellow Asians like you, and the rest of it. That is what it does in the region. That it purports to show that it doesn't have a hangover like the imprint or the footprint of the American or the British, so to speak. But the conflict would continue for a while, because Iran will keep on funding them as such, because that is the only way, that is the foreign policy guideline of the IRGC and the militia, which runs the state in more ways than one.
Thank you. So now, two last questions. Iran's relationship with the extra-regional countries. First, India. As we say, the main Islamic revolution guy, Khomeini, in some circles it is said that his ancestors came from Barabanki, in UP. In many
Near
circles,
Lucknow, Kintur district.
yes, yes.
Kintur district, Lucknow. His great grandfather, they were there in Kintur. And you see, once the Oudh province was taken over by the British, they decided to leave and they migrated to Khomein in central Iran,
Yes,
which
yes.
explains why, when in the modern period, when everyone started getting surnames, their surname became Khomeini.
Yes. So India's relationship with Iran also, in the backdrop of their ties with Pakistan, as we have seen in the past, because of the anti-Shia issues in Pakistan, that both the countries have fought with each other. Iranian diplomats were killed in Pakistan, and there were anti-Shia terrorist groups like Sipah Sahaba, Lashkar-e-Jhangvi. They have been active. Even on the other side, Shia extremist groups were also active. So that also needs to be taken into consideration, and we would like you to discuss a bit more about it. Then Iran's relationship with China, and also Iran's relationship with the Russians, because in the recent times there is this Russian emphasis on the multipolarity in the world order, and they are emphasizing on the civilizational states, and they consider Iran as a very crucial pole of the civilizational states in the world order. So this is one question, and the second question is, Do you see any future for the collapse of the regime, this Islamic regime in Iran?
I can take the last one first.
Okay,
Uh,
thank you.
it's a strong regime. And that reminds me of when people talk about Pakistan as a failed state and it's about to collapse like a house of cards. I've always taken the view, as you would know in Usanas fora, that Pakistan is a strong state. It's not going to go down anytime soon. I take the same view of the regime 45 years on, which is completely entrenched in all aspects of society. There is too much at stake for them to lose out. And it can you can call it a thoroughly discredited regime. That is true, but it will not just go down easily. It will continue being a repressive regime for its own population, and also because of the fact that the Iranian opposition in the diaspora is a mess. Uh, Infighting, egotistical clashes, and plain disorganization. If you were someone in the West who wanted to bring about regime change, the first question you must ask yourself, Dr. Pandya, is who do I talk to? I need someone credible, I need someone respectable and compelling. All I'm looking at are a bunch of clowns, quite frankly, in Washington or in Germany. So the question is, you have nobody to talk to in terms of an opposition to support. There are various oppositions, but they're all disparate and at times working against even each other, though they seem to be commonly linked to getting rid of the regime. So that is not going to happen anytime soon. Um, in the case of relations with Iran, Russia, and Iran, China, both civilizational linkages too, also because all three are wedded to an anti-Western worldview. So obviously, politics makes strange bedfellows. I mean, again, the Persians and the Russians also have a history of fighting back to the 15th century, just like with the Ottomans. And the Russians, Russo-Persian wars, where the Russians hammered the Persians in the 18th and 19th century too. Uh, Notwithstanding that, Iran has always been wary of the Russian bear, even during Soviet days, but even out of the dissolution of the Soviet Union. And this newfangled alliance and cozying up, and particularly with what is happening with the Ukraine war, is due to the fact that they are both linked by this distaste of what they call the US's unipolarity, and that we ought to have a multipolar world, and therefore it plays to their anti-Western worldview. And of course, in terms of their domestic consumption, it goes down very well with their supporters too. Hence, that explains Iran-Russia cooperation on the nuclear aspect, but also in trade and elsewhere. Incidentally, as part of the 2015 agreement, Russia was supposed to buy some of the spent fuel and have it transported to its sites also. But that fell through once Trump pulled the deal. The Sino-Iranian deal of 25-year agreement that was signed and much hype was made about. Please note that it was indeed a lot of hype, because if you study the Persian text, including Article 6 among the clauses, the text is non-binding. No sums of money have been assured, and people made, particularly the New York Times, exaggerated it like the deal of the century or the millennium, like $200 billion and this, that, and the other. Nothing of the sort. No figures have been discussed. No question of Chinese bases in the Persian Gulf have been brought forth. Jawad Zarif was forced to report to the Tehran Times because the diaspora went into a tizzy as to, you are selling out Iran and we are going to become another Pakistan, a puppet auction state to the Chinese. Jawad Zarif said, not a handspan of soil is going to be given to the Chinese or to any foreigners, so you can be sure of that. And no funds have been committed in this so-called Sino-Iranian agreement. As I mentioned, it's a non-binding treaty by both contracting parties. What the Chinese have done since the Green Revolution of 2009 and the discredited results of Ahmadinejad's second term is that they have supplied Tehran with deep packet information technology to Iranian intelligence services to obviously curtail the internet and for restrictive measures and to keep a check on its population and slowing down the internet and the like. That intel cooperation between Beijing and Tehran is a given. We do know that for a fact. Coming to India, I want to take that with Pakistan for the simple reason that if Indians think they are experienced after 7 decades as a republic in strategic autonomy, trust you me, the Iranians can give you a run for your money. They can be a social pariah, which they are. India has respectability abroad. Iran doesn't. But Iran, like India, has the ability to say no where it wants to, even to friends and allies. The prickliness with which I mentioned how they deal with India recently. And please note, the regime in Tehran since 79 has always played off India and Pakistan for its benefits. It has consistently done so, and it tends to blow hot, blow cold with one or the other at times. Um, with Pakistan, Rafsanjani in 1986 told Zia point blank, take $1 million and give me an atomic weapon now, because obviously the war was going so badly with Iraq. Zia did not oblige. And again, Pakistan could play strategic autonomy too, because if you remember, due to Persian Gulf shipping that had gone down because of the 80-88 Iraq war, Karachi was the lifeline to Iran and the breadline for all rations. It was through Karachi port that Iran's food supplies right through the 8-year war and Iran was sustained due to that. And Zia was politic enough to do that, much to the annoyance of the Arab Sunnis who were already subventing his regime and Pakistan's budget. But he had to keep Iran in its pleas too because of his own Shia minority as such. So strategic autonomy can be replicated in several instances where this happens. On Kashmir, of course, whether the Shah or whether with the current regime, including the Iranian ambassador a few months ago after the 2019 Kashmir re-administration was done after Article 370, mentioned to an Indian news media outlet that we want to see justice in Kashmir. I mean, diplomats don't normally talk to their host country news outlets in such blunt terms. But the fact that he could bring himself to speak like this tells you something. Well, it tells you what is Iran's position on Kashmir. I mean, they may not privately say it, but they would feel that a Muslim province ought to be part of a Muslim state, even if their relationship with Pakistan is not exactly the greatest, and it never has been, incidentally. It still tells you where their sense of affiliations do lie, as such. But Iran does play off India and Pakistan consistently to suit itself. It has done so since 79. And both India and Pakistan are wary and want to also cozy up to Iran. India because of the Pakistan card, Pakistan because of the India card. And Pakistan also equally feels suspicious about Iran because they feel it's cozying up too much with India. Please remember, the Iranian Navy's submarines were rehauled, midlife maintenance was done at Mazgon Docks, Bombay. Iranian Navy personnel have also visited Cochin and Vishakhapatnam. So there has been some sense of defense toing and froing. But of course, the Indians have been cautious about it, and quite rightly so, because they do realize that transfer of technology from Israel or Washington cannot be shared under any circumstances with Tehran as such.
Thank you, Burzine. So now, with this last question, we come to the end of this interview.